Welcome everyone to the next plenary discussion, What to Consider When Working with Data, Perspectives from the Field, continuing the tradition of long titles. And we're looking forward to getting into some of the practical elements of what was just evoked on the stage previously. I'm Olivia Russell. I'm the Executive Director of the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED, and really looking forward to a conversation with our panelists today. I'd like to just take a moment first to do my own round of thank yous. Firstly, to the Complex Risk Analytics Fund, CRAFT, for supporting this, bringing us all together, and really leading the charge on developing this ecosystem, as well as all the contributors. I also want to thank NYU CIC for putting together such a stellar agenda. Really looking forward to the set of conversations over the next 4 days, 4.5 days now. And finally, to Google for hosting us in these beautiful, calming blue space that I understand is called the Goblin King Room. So looking forward to, doing that justice here today. So I want to just set the stage a little bit for the context of the panel. So many of us, individuals and organizations, are really looking to integrate data more into our work, decision-making, policy development, program design, and we're looking to figure out how to do that best. And there is, at the same time, a bit of a lack of consensus in terms of what are the best practices for data collection, management, quality assurance of that data, ensuring interoperability, as well as how each organization can really prepare to make the best use of data. So hiring the right people, developing the right resources, and the right training. So today we'll be talking a little bit more about that, and I want to introduce my panelists. First, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Kadiyun Kishi, Head of Data Science with ACLED. Welcome. Nice to have you with us. Next, Jose Luengo Cabrera, Crisis Risk Specialist with UNDP Crisis Bureau. Nice to have you with us, Jose.
Thank you.
And I think we have a third who should be joining us on the screen very soon, Seth Caldwell, who's a data scientist with OCHA Centre for Humanitarian Data, so he'll be rounding out the discussion. And I want to remind all of everyone who's joining online to go ahead and start adding your questions as we go so that we can address those towards the end of the discussion. And I suppose a gentle reminder that this is being recorded, so I've been told to mention that, so everybody behave yourselves. And we can get right into it, I think, while we're waiting for Seth to join. The first question is to you, Kadiyun. You work with us at ACLED to manage all of our data as well as lead our data science programming. That's quite a, hi Seth, quite a complex endeavor and lots of moving parts. Can you just walk us through what that looks like, how we do that at ACLED?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. So for those of you that might not be familiar with what ACLED data look like, we are an event data set, which means every row in our data set represents a single event of political violence or demonstration in over 240 countries and territories around the world, and we update that data every week. So as you can imagine, this involves a lot of moving parts, a lot of people in a lot of places working simultaneously to make this happen on a really tight time schedule. So what my team really focuses on, I think, are two main components. One is ensuring consistency, and the other is eliminating human error as much as possible. ACLED is a human-led research project in the sense that we don't automate any of our coding and our sourcing, and we don't generate any information through automation. Everything is sort of, in our opinion, the gold standard of coding, which is by people who are analyzing the information and creating event information out of that. But with that comes challenges when it comes to how we can collect that information in a standardized way and then send it out. So some of the things that we try to really emphasize with consistency is both internally and externally. So internally, making sure that our researchers are very well trained on our methodology. So when one person collects an information about a battle event and another one does as well, they're talking about the same thing, that we know that the data are consistent in what they represent. We also try to make the data entry process as easy as possible. Complicated systems are not always the best way forward. You need to take into account, I think it was mentioned in the panel before us, about the environments in which people are working, many people need to be offline when they're collecting this information and inputting it. So creating a really complicated app on a website that's only available online is not always the most efficient answer. Creating steps that sort of shorten the amount of the steps people need to go through. So if they are inputting information, creating drop-down menus for them so they can select things. That also reduces human error with getting rid of typos, things like that that might crop up. And then externally, emphasizing consistency in the way that our data are accessible. So we have a set schedule of when data are updated each week. We have certain regions that are updated on Mondays, and you get new information. Certain regions come out on Tuesdays, and our users can depend on us to provide that information on a timely basis at the same time every week, so they know where to come to. And the way to think about it sort of is our goal is once you learn what ACLED data look like, you always know what ACLED data look like. And you don't need to relearn that every time you try to look at our data set. And if there's ever times that we do need to change the structure of our data set, like what happened last year when we added a few new columns, et cetera, we take a lot of steps to try to mitigate the disruption that causes for our end users by communicating that information, educating about what is changing, how to adapt your own scripts and your own systems to accommodate for those changes, et cetera. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Katie. So we're talking about one specific data set. Obviously, ACLED is one part of the picture for complex crises. So I want to go to you, Seth, next and talk about, in the context of these very complex crises where we do need to pull in many different data sets, not just conflict data, but all sorts of data and bringing them together. There's a requirement for a high level of integration, interoperability, which is such an important buzzword that we've been kicking around quite a bit preparing for this panel and what that means really. And I would love to hear from you, why do you see data interoperability as so important in humanitarian analysis? And if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, in its most basic terms, interoperability, it's quite simple. It's quite clear why it's valuable. That, as you say, we're in these complex crises with, often limited timeframes for doing analysis, and having data sets that can immediately be joined and used together, whether it's using ACLED conflict data alongside data for displacement or food insecurity or any other indicators. There's just clear value in making sure that administrative units are, used, that are identical, that, it's tidy and, available to be, easily used in kind of, sort of column vector format. And then essentially there's little effort to integrate into the data that we already might have from on the ground or from other resources. And I think people are relatively familiar with that concept, but I really like, what Katun was just saying there about this kind of idea of consistency and reliability and stability of data, because I think more and more the humanitarian analytics space is moving beyond sort of single-use analytics, kind of a one-off during a crisis. And, we know other buzzwords alongside interoperability are, kind of this anticipatory action or risk analysis. These are things that, by their nature and in definition are often global at scale and, have a long temporal frame where we're looking across, months, if not years. So simple interoperability is not just, this single data set working in this single instance, but having stability in formatting, stability in the ability to access it, and knowing that month to month, if you take the time to integrate this data into your workflows, it will remain kind of in that same format and setting and not break something down the line. And I think that's often lacking maybe on the more humanitarian side for the data producers, and something that we're hoping, moving forward is more and more emphasized, and something that the HDX team is trying to work on with kind of consistent APIs and ensuring that donors, that other NGOs and those accessing the data can rely on that data to remain in a similar format. But even there, just to note, there's always going to be limits to interoperability. Administrative units aren't consistent. We use common operational data sets. Others use GAL for the admin boundaries. Some, like ACLED, is events data, but we might want to align that with daily data. There's different definitions of what we're trying to measure. And so we always need to be prepared that there's going to need to be some munging and analysis and work done to truly integrate different data sets together.
I want to take it one step further and think about how we then take these various data sets and hopefully they're well integrated and interoperable and then bring them into analysis. Jose, I want to go to you. And at UNDP, you're working with quite diverse data sets to anticipate, communicate, and ideally, by extension, to prevent complex risks. So how do you approach this work? And maybe if you can share some best practices for us in terms of how to make the best use of data in analysis.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah. In a nutshell, we're the data consumers, right? So Seth, Katayun, they do the hard work really because they prepare the data sets in a way that makes it easier for us to analyze. But that doesn't mean that all data sets are standardized or tidy in a way that makes us able to ingest it automatically and visualize and analyze automatically. So the whole idea is that you have a setup or an infrastructure, let's say. And my colleagues Corrado and Sanju can attest to how having infrastructure makes it much more easier to do the analysis, right? Because you are essentially replicating across countries, across indicators, different types of analyses. And so we have a tool which is essentially a communication tool because you want to communicate results, trends, frequency, magnitudes, spatial distribution to inform decisions. And something like the crisis risk dashboard, which is kind of our bread and butter, is used as a tracking sort of tool, which enables people to just filter through the country that they're interested in or the indicator that they're interested in to just gauge, numerically, is something going up, is something going down, is something more concentrated or dispersed. And that's already something that gives us an idea, right? It's sometimes a very high level, but it's where you start. And in and of itself, visuals is, in a way, the most digestible manner to get a sense of things. And then you dive deeply with, in our case, the collaboration of country offices that provide qualitative information to sort of complement what we're providing.
Extending that a little bit further, if you could share more about principal caveats, and so thinking about some of the limitations there. Obviously, there's a lot we can do with data, but what do we need to watch out for? Are there risks that you might highlight?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing, and we always argue this, and I've talked about CLINA many times in Katayun, data doesn't necessarily mean evidence, right? Because data can be manipulated, data can be biased, misrepresented. Data, in a way, is just stored information, right? Information is a huge sea of things. Things are happening all the time. And data is whatever is captured. And captured in a way that usually is in a format that can be measurable over time and over space. And quantification is easier to understand than speech. Like when you say something's bigger, but by how much? Data is what gives us this. So we depart from that basis that anytime we use a data set, it's with a pinch of salt. And usually the data providers in their code books talk about these caveats. And a measure of knowing how good they are in terms of their transparency is how much they share about the shortfalls of their own data. So for us, the main caveat is that, and saying that it's complementary, right? We run the risk of shooting in the dark if we just use data-driven analyses, because so many of the important things that happen in conflict areas is determined by politics, and politics cannot necessarily be modeled or included in a data set. So there's always a missing piece there, and that's where we try to work with the country offices to be complementary.
Thanks. I want to go back to you, Seth, and talk a little bit more about the interoperability that you were describing, and particularly the limits. How would you suggest, or how can analysts really contend with and meet these challenges associated with where we're currently standing in terms of interoperability for humanitarian data sets?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of analytics, it's again, I think relatively simple. The examples I provided, maybe events data, you can find ways to convert that into daily data, or if you're using different definitions of administrative boundaries, you can find mappings between the two. I think what I'd really like to emphasize is that, all of this work in terms of kind of creating this next level of interoperability that, isn't necessarily direct from the raw data, is the role of analysts, and it has been for a long time. But I think in the same way that we talk about interoperability for data from the data providers, we need to start talking about, the interoperability and availability of data in terms of how analysts are producing them and using them and publishing them in the future. So there no longer needs to be this you've done this once for your use case and your analysis and this kind of single use analytics. But if I've done the work to make, ACLED data interoperable with another data set, we should have responsibilities as analysts to share this back and be transparent and be open and kind of push forward the kind of analytic space in the same direction that a lot of these conversations from data providers are sitting. Because I think there's limits, again, to what data providers can provide. But when we're doing our analysis, when we're creating interoperability, for maybe our dashboards or maybe our PDF reports or an Excel file, I think we have a responsibility to be transparent in how we achieved that, but also really public and pushing for that to be reused by others to reduce duplication and ensure that we have, true efficiencies within the system. And we're trying to work on this topic a bit in terms of making analytics accountable. And I think there's been a long period where everyone can produce in an analytical output, whether it's a graph or a one-page report or a fact sheet, but there's very little kind of validation on the value that is provided to the system. And that's a much wider conversation, but I think a really key part of that is making sure that we're not really spending loads of time all tackling the same problem that we, face as a, kind of entire humanitarian analysis ecosystem and start working together to kind of jointly solve these problems.
Thanks, Seth. I want to go back to the data set production or management side of things, because as I was saying in the beginning, I think there's a lot of organizations that maybe aren't producing their own data set, but they want to, or they want to expand. And so I want to go to you, Katayun, and ask, what are some things that you would say are overlooked in data management, or that you wished those who are getting into it for the first time or expanding data set production would keep in mind, best practices?
Yeah, I think that one thing that's really key is to take a step back first and foremost and think about what is the information that is missing in the world that I'm trying to collect data on and to provide. And not only, taking the time to create, a methodology and a code book and all of that, but also to think about what are the biases that I am inherently introducing into a data set, because all data sets have biases. How can I best communicate that down the line, et cetera. But I think something that Monica mentioned in the last session about, more data is not necessarily good data, and it's not necessarily the goal. And I think when you're thinking about conflict data in particular, in this sort of space that we're all operating in, it's extremely complex. It's very multifaceted. There's an entire story to be told about every event that we have in our data set. And it can seem sort of wrong sometimes as someone that's a researcher, but really your goal is to distill that down to its core elements, because otherwise, when I'm talking about structured data here specifically, you can't compare these data points with each other if you try to introduce too much nuance to them. So in some level, you need to be able to make hard decisions about forcing certain things into certain categories so that you can then at the next level take a step back and make sort of analyses and sweeping comparisons and trends, et cetera. I think another thing to consider is once you've started data collection, changing things is a big deal. So deciding to add a new category, deciding to change the way that you code certain phenomena that you're seeing in the data, that all has implications for backwards trends in the data. So for example, if at ACLED we decided to introduce an entirely new event type, we can't just decide one morning, we're going to add this to our data set. Moving forward, we're going to have a new event type, because now all of a sudden it makes it look like starting in 2023, this new phenomenon occurred in the world of this type of an event. So you need to backcode. You need to go through your data and update everything that you've collected up until that point to then reflect the new reality that you're trying to communicate with your data set. I think that the sort of point about consistency that I was trying to make earlier is really important when it comes to even the way that you are writing down that information that you have in your data set. So it's not really the place for people to sort of expand on ideas like within, a spreadsheet. You want to stick to the categories that you've decided. You want to build tools and systems for your researchers to use that makes that process easier, that does error checking for them. And we can, talk in the Q&A as well about sort of what those tools might look like, or how sort of emerging technologies might be helpful in building those tools and the types of things that you can apply. But I think in general, my first advice would be to take a step back, really think about the types of situations you might see that you might want to record. And the more thinking, the more, measure twice, cut once. It really applies, I think, to data set production especially.
Thanks. And I think also as we build out this ecosystem together, hopefully there'll be more opportunities to share across data providers too, so learn from one another so as to not cut the cloth wrong a second time, or however we would extend that analogy. So I think it's come up twice, more data is not necessarily better, but at the same time, we do have a lot of data out there. There's data everywhere. In an arguably fragmented humanitarian data ecosystem, I want to turn to you, Jose. Why do you think it's so important to standardize cross-indicator data sets to analyze these multidimensional crises?
Yeah, because it is multidimensional, it is necessary to have all these indicators or data sets have a degree of interoperability, because essentially, like Seth mentioned before, you're bound to be measuring things like how violence can impact displacement, how food insecurity is impacted by different set of factors. And you can do statistical analyses on these, right? But the key is that not all data providers provide, let's say, the structure of the spreadsheet or the format of their data set in a way that is easy to merge and easy to plot or analyze together. And so we spend a lot of time, usually about 40 to 60%, cleaning data sets, right? Doing data wrangling in order to have data sets that are similar so that they can be analyzed simultaneously. And basically, this is very time consuming. And for me, a platform like HDX is critical because it really does go to show the multidimensionality of things. And because they go through a validating process, in essence, they're vetting for the, let's say, the degree of professionality that people like ACLED go into putting together the data sets. How transparent is the methodology? Can anyone from the outside access and verify, just like with academics? Is the code up on GitHub so that anyone can look it up and trace how the data is wrangled and how they come to the results that they come to? And so this is, again, it goes back to the ecosystem idea that because there's so many things happening at the same time, usually at very high frequency, and you can see that with ACLED, for example, data is usually the best way to process mass information. So it's easier to process than, say, with text or speech. And so that's why it's important. But it comes back to this idea, and we've talked about it, tidy data sets. And that's what ACLED is, and that's what some of the IOM data sets are. But then a lot of the World Bank and IMF data sets are not. Essentially, every column is a variable, every row is an observation. This is the way in which most, if not all, computer softwares that we use to analyze the data read the data in the best and most efficient way possible and minimizes errors. Because when you want to filter, like Kathleen just said, once you know ACLED once, you know it for the rest. It's true, because then that means that when you're filtering or you're doing percentage changes, you know almost by nature that you're doing the right thing. And so I would emphasize kind of what Seth is saying, and Kathleen as well, openness to methodology, openness to caveats. CLINA has always been very vocal about the shortfalls of collecting data and why it's important to talk about it. When she talked about fatalities, it's exactly that. There's a push to glamorize data as if it's evidence-driven, and sometimes data isn't evidence because it can be manipulated, whatever it is. So it's just always bearing in mind, yes, multidimensionality, yes, data, but full of all these caveats that we need to bear in mind.
Thanks. So I think we've been going over a lot of the caveats and the best practices and where we stand today, right now. But I want to turn back to you, Seth, and look to the future a little bit more and discuss with the group, where would you like to see humanitarian data and analysis going in the next decade? Where do you want us to be, especially with regards to interoperability, which you've been speaking a lot about?
Yeah, I think the base level is, we should really be in 10 years' time at a space where data is, by standard, interoperable, available via API, open, and available to all. Because I think there's some interesting research, that goes on in the kind of tech monopoly community about how interoperability is a way to kind of maintain monopolies. And I think it's an interesting way to consider to this problem where we currently exist in a world where the people that produce data, especially in the humanitarian space, are often the ones that are best placed to use it for analysis. like Jose just said, 50% of UNDP's time is spent pulling data sets together just for use. Most organizations don't have these resources, the time to do that. And it means that if you produce data, but you don't make it interoperable to others, you're essentially monopolizing that data solely for yourself to use in your own dashboards or products or something like that. And I think in 10 years' time, I think that should be, kind of outlawed or viewed as kind of, completely inappropriate. I think, we need proactiveness on the side of data providers, like what ACLED is talking about in this plenary now, but from all data providers, particularly within the humanitarian community. I think, to get there, we need donors to suddenly say, like, we'll no longer be funding petrol vehicles in, or selling them in this country by 2030. We'll no longer fund data, analysis or data production if it's not interoperable, shared, and transparent by a certain year. And I think there's a lot that we can do to proactively coordinate the space as well and ensure that it's, lots of data coming online and being interoperable is also going to be a lot of data that speaks to the same question. And I think we need to be careful that we're not simply flooding the space with information without any clear use cases for it. You still risk things being not used or lost in the noise. And I think there's an idea of radical interoperability. I don't really know what to call it. I've been thinking about it in the past week as we prepared for the plenary. But I really think there's no reason why there's different ways to measure a lot of the phenomena that we now currently measure from, different organizations collecting data. I'm not going to call anyone out by name. This is not a, kind of a beat down during this session. But I think we need to come together and agree in ways that key data sets used in the humanitarian space can be measured. And with this agreement and with this coordination, you can actually break it down to interoperability, where organizations can step in and collect data using an agreed common methodology. So no longer it has to be this organization's methodology for collecting data on displacement, or this organization's methodology for collecting data on household hunger. It's an agreed common method that everyone can use and plug into, that creates analysis that can come from any organization, large or small, to inform the space. And I don't think this is that radical an idea. This is exactly what the SMART nutrition surveys have done in the humanitarian sector by coming with a kind of agreed platform for nutrition data, a set of standards and tools that anyone can use, and a way to validate those results. So I think it's hopefully something that as we move forward over the next few years, we can push for as the coordinators of humanitarian response and improve the way that the analytics ecosystem talks with itself.
Thanks, Seth. So looking to the future still, I think we can't do that without mentioning AI, right? It's obligatory at this point in this AI palooza kind of scenario that we find ourselves. So I want to ask you, Kadioun, thinking about some of the new technologies that are available now and where we'll be even in the next 10 years, how can these technologies be used for data set management, quality management, and optimization?
Yeah, I think that we have talked a lot, obviously, about the ways in which AI, machine learning, all of these types of interesting technologies can sort of contribute to the end product with the analysis part. So can we build prediction models? Can we, use generative AI to answer questions about the data, et cetera? But it also has a role to play in the data set management and production element of it. And I mentioned earlier that ACLED's a human-led research project. So we're not looking to use natural language processing, for example, to code our events for us, but we are cognizant of the efficiencies that tools like this can contribute to a data set. So we're producing data at a mass scale every week. This is a huge operation. It takes a lot of manpower, it takes a lot of hours and work. And so how can we use AI to make that process faster and more efficient? So one nice thing is that we currently sort of have a baseline of what our standards are, right? So we know that when a person goes to a certain source, these are the articles that are relevant about political violence, about demonstrations. This is the way that they synthesize that information and puts it there. That creates a really robust training data set for us. So what we can do then is look into ways of building out scrapers, for example, to collect that information from the websites and then to parse out which articles might be most relevant for the researcher based on the types of articles that they pulled manually in the past. It doesn't necessarily, doesn't take that information and do the work for the researcher, but it makes it certainly that much easier. When it comes to coding, we're looking into ways of how can we have machine learning models that can kind of take a first stab at coding an event, about categorizing it the way that it thinks that we would, but then going in with a person and reviewing those results and sort of giving them basically a head start at coding that event, but definitely not leaving it fully in the hands of a machine learning model. I think that especially when it comes to really sensitive information like conflict data, this is information that is life or death. And we have a responsibility as data providers to provide the most accurate, validated data that we can. And that means not necessarily putting it fully in the hands of AI to take forward. But it does mean trying to clean it up using those new tools whenever we can. So to reduce the human error that can be introduced, and to make it more efficient and available faster, and being able to collect it from more places and more robustly. I have a lot of thoughts on this if anyone has any questions in the Q&A.
Thanks, Kadian. So building on what Kadian was alluding to, Jose, I wanted to talk a little bit more about where qualitative information comes in here. So obviously, to understand a particular context, we're referring to a lot of quantitative data sets, but can you tell us a little bit more about why it's important, especially in the context of conflict analysis, to pair those conflict data sets or conflict data sources with qualitative information?
Yeah, I mean, I think we depart from the premise that we're looking at countries where collecting data can be hazardous, even dangerous, where there can be a lot of distortions. We see examples of militaries exaggerating the number of militants they've killed, or whenever there's malpractice, it's put under the rug kind of thing. And so we depart from the idea that data can only tell us so much, and data-driven analyses are analyses of things that have been captured and properly captured with all sorts of imperfections, obviously. And so that's where the element of qualitative comes in. And as previously mentioned, crises, these type of crises, especially conflicts, armed conflicts, are highly politicized. And a lot of what drives it, well, one, it's erratic. And because it's erratic, it's very hard to model. If anything, things like coups are outliers because they're very difficult to predict, simply because you cannot exactly model or put into a data set or quantify how a particular subset of the military is going to behave. You can have indicators that point to it, but all of that richness of information is probably going to come from people that are in that country, that are getting information that doesn't go into data sets, because it's a very labor-intensive process as well, which means just not everything can be captured. We're limited by it. And I think the key is the technologies are there. AI is there to be able to have a sort of potential to be used much better, but it's still in a nascent state. And for that reason, everything that has to do with advanced data-driven analytics is in the process of getting there, but we're not there yet. And what I think is most important to emphasize actually is that it's a question of resources. So technology is there, but resources, and what I mean by this is human resources. Your human coders, Seth can attest to, it's also human-driven to collect this data and to wrangle the data in something like R or Python. My colleague here, Sanju, she's our data scientist. She can attest to the fact that when you're trying to do social media analysis, there's a lot of noise, right? So it's very difficult to identify the patterns that you want to sort of see and the trends that you want to see. Same with GDELT, which is actually, the epitome of it's a vacuum cleaner that absorbs information in a non-discriminatory manner. And then someone like Sanju highlights the idea that it's very difficult to categorize it because it's so broad, it's everything. And that's where an example like ACLED comes in, which is like, you need humans to be coding things because you need to simplify it in a way that it's communicable. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to communicate. And what you want to do is just communicate in order for certain decisions to be made a priori in a better manner.
I think that's a good segue into some questions. So we have been getting some questions online, and then I want to make sure we have some time for those of you in the audience who I can kind of see, so hopefully I'll be able to see hands. So the first one, just building somewhat connected to what you were just sharing, Jose, is from Andres Pitta for you, Seth. I understand interoperability relates to the technical aspect of connecting data to maximize its use, but how is the substantive aspect of data considered in interoperability, i.e. having a well-rounded analysis of issues represented in the data? If you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. This is the next level of kind of, interoperability, whether the way that the data has been collected, the way that it's been measured is, actually useful for, what our use case is. And it really depends, case by case, what exactly you need. But it's always important to be, considering, what might be missing, what was mismeasured. And, again, as Jose mentioned, where are the limits of what we can tell just by using, quantitative analysis and methods. And I think that goes well beyond really the idea of interoperability. But it's, again, I mentioned analytical accountability before. I think it's something we're pushing, that what we at least need from the particularly the analytics producer side and also the data producer side is, in terms of interoperability, yes, the formatting of the data, but there's transparency, openness, and documentation that's clear, concise, and easy to access and use to make sure that all of the caveats for any data sets that have been produced and that we want to use are clear to anyone that's taking that forward into some other decision-making framework or analytical piece. So this kind of transparency, I think, is just really probably the most critical aspect to ensure that interoperability is not simply just throwing around a bunch of garbage into another system that produces garbage.
Good note to end on. So now I want to open it up to questions from the audience here. I see there's a microphone in the back. So if you have a question, if you could raise your hand high.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I'm Philip Zimmer. I'm a graduate researcher at MIT at the intersection of political science and computer science. And I wanted to pose a question towards a point that was mentioned very late in the discussion, which is that because of all the noise, it's sometimes hard to identify the pattern. Now, I want to play devil's advocate and say there's not always a pattern to identify, right? We have this notion of conflicts being highly unique. So just curious how you guys go about still extracting useful information when there's actually no pattern to extract and find.
Kat, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah. I think it's interesting. Like, we have a core methodology at ACLED that applies to all conflicts in every country that we look at. But we are also very aware that these methodologies need to be tailored to specific country situations. And we do that. And when we do make those decisions, we then document it really thoroughly on the website. So if we know, for example, in certain countries, the use of communal militias is much more common than in other places, we might document those actors really closely and specifically. But that all comes down to having an understanding sort of at a qualitative level of what's happening in these conflicts and these environments, and then being able to create these patterns that make them relate to other places. Because we can't get caught, I think, in a trap of thinking every conflict is unique, and you can't possibly compare these lessons learned to another context. And I think it extends also into the work that we do on prediction of conflict. So I'll put in a plug for our prediction tool, the conflict alert system, that looks at predicting the number of events that will occur in the next 6 months in each country. And what we found there is quite a wide variety of where that is extremely accurate and where it needs, a bit of work. Or we'll be the first to tell you that conflict prediction models, machine learning models are not the tool to be used in every conflict situation. In places where it's a relatively new conflict, where it's extremely volatile, there's no pattern to pick up on yet. And so it's not the best tool to use there. Whereas, for example, last month in Myanmar, we predicted the exact number of events that we saw because that's a well-established conflict that has significant variation over time, but that there is a pattern to be picked up there, and the machine learning model does very well at then being able to predict those. So it is a matter, I think, of being familiar with the cases that you're looking at, adapting your methodology and your data collection processes to suit that specific context, and then knowing exactly which tools are appropriate to use in each of those situations.
Thanks. Other questions in the room?
Do you mind if I also?
Yeah, please.
I mean, from our perspective, obviously, because it affects us in many ways, because we're trying to look for patterns all the time, because our intent is to try to inform so that things can be mobilized, people, resources, to avoid any form of deterioration or increase in violence. Oftentimes there are no patterns indeed, especially with conflict. You see, and I talked with Clina about this, you have civilian massacres that occur all of a sudden. You have a massive spike. pretty much impossible to predict with data when you're modeling. And the idea of noise, it's there, it's true, and that's difficult to filter it out and try to see whether something is following certain patterns. There are cases where patterns can be identified, but again, because of the hazardous nature of these environments, finding patterns is in and of itself the most difficult task. If anything, you can find trend lines, if something is on average increasing over time or decreasing over time. But this is where I would emphasize again, going back to qualitative, which is you might be able to find more patterns by looking at qualitative information than data because of the difficulties of collecting that information and transforming it into data, because non-data or non-quantifiable things matter so much.
Thanks.
And
I think
I'll
there
just
was a question.
not to add to this conversation, as I would have a lot to say, but a shout out actually for Katjun and I are on a plenary panel about kind of conflict and displacement prediction on Wednesday. So yeah, I'm sure we'll be discussing many similar questions then. So please do show up and attend. It'll be very interesting.
Thanks, Seth. Yes, we always have to get the plugs in. I think there was a question over there. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much for this panel. It's very instructive. My question was, so you described throughout the problem of, let's say, consolidating different data science practices, right? And I was wondering whether one can contemplate the idea of platformizing these practices in a sense. So placing all these data in a common source, in a kind of standardized format, and standardized data structures, if you will, as well as proposing, let's say, or inviting for common practices over how to study and process that data, and in which kinds of visualizations and so on. Is this something desirable, or is it better to indeed maintain one's own peculiarities, if you will, given the difference in case studies or the actors using this data?
Do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's because it's what we have to do all the time. The most essential part is replicability. For one, because that means that other people can use it, right? We're not in the private sector. The idea here is that we're working towards a goal that everyone should be able to share information because it's a public good, essentially. And this is where infrastructure comes in, which I mentioned at the beginning but didn't detail. And it's things like that we put together, and Corrado has been following this for years, is the setting up of a data warehouse that uses APIs, like Seth mentioned, and basically automates the process of ingesting this wide array of data sets that come together into one platform, right, on a cloud, and are then imported into software like Tableau or R, for us to be able to analyze it. So, to generate scatter plots or to generate just different visualizations that we deem useful to be able to inform. But ultimately, and I think this is where HGX is so important and where I think they should be getting much more resources, is in their platform, you can go country by country, and per every country you'll have different indicators. But sometimes those indicators, you want to merge them. And so sometimes I have to do a bit of data wrangling to put, violence and displacement and see a scatter plot, for example. There's still some work to be done there. So it's desirable to have, ideally, a UN-wide or an interagency-wide platform where everyone accesses the plethora of data that is available, and that is available in a standardized format, obviously, to reduce the time that we sometimes have to spend cleaning the data, which delays the time of which we want to deliver our results in order to inform, especially when people's lives are at stake. So for me, it's highly desirable, and I think we've talked about this. The ecosystem is fragmented because data providers, although I think you're all making progress because you're making more and more partnerships and hiring more people that are researchers on the ground. And that's the most valuable thing, really. I think that's coming together, and I think that kind of sort of epitomizes craft. Instead of each member state putting money separately without coordinating, they're now coordinating, so they're doing this effort to put everyone together in, let's say, the same basket, and hopefully produce the same kind of technology or ecosystem for everyone to access it in the same way. And that also reduces possible discrepancies in results. For example, if we've written some code that is a little bit different than Seth's, we might have a different result. But because we've written it in code, we can trace it back. And so traceability is also an essential issue that we also want to put an emphasis on because, again, it's a degree of transparency, which is essential because you're dealing with public goods. And then for people just to verify that information, you have a lot of media reports that cite sources, right? But like a confidential source. you go to ACLED and you can see the number of data sources that are provided, and you have a minimal threshold, right, of sources in order to be included, which means it's only when there's a sufficient amount of information provided that it's included in the data set. And so when you put all this together, it facilitates our job of trying to inform. But they're doing the heavy lifting, so I think Seth might have quite a lot to say about that, actually.
Seth?
Yeah, sure. I won't take too much more time on the question, but I do think, like Jose mentioned, right, that we have craft. We have an immense data ecosystem that's growing, compared to 8 years ago when I entered the humanitarian space. It's anything you want to have measured exists now. I think the risk is, and what I was trying to highlight in my kind of the plenary, was that I don't think just because loads of initiatives are being funded and more data is being produced that they will inevitably be speaking to each other. They might be interoperable, they might be available via API, but it's going to be up to the end users to have to select which ones they want to use, how you integrate them, and where you actually want to pull things from or not. And I think that's where I think interoperability needs to shift into. I think like the question that drove this response highlighted that we could have maybe a single platform that starts to decide, okay, if we're collecting data on displacement, actually, what does that need to look like? What should we be collecting? And so it's interoperability of a system for collecting displacement information so that any organization can come in and run a survey or monitor displacement to feed into that, rather than having disparate measures from different organizations. And I think you could do that across a lot of the common data sets that we do. And it's a lot, again, like how ACLED has done this for conflict with a kind of measured approach to defining variables and codes in collecting the data. I think we could have something as structured in the humanitarian space in particular for the key data sets there. If we have a key coordinated effort with buy-in from all key analytical organizations.
Thanks, Seth. So I'm aware that we're all that's standing between you all and lunch, so I think we can take one more question. I see someone in the middle, in the back there. Let's do that.
Hi, thank you. My name is Quay. I'm a security analytics consultant with Intelligences. And my question is, I know there's been a lot of conversation around opening up the information and making it more accessible. But I'm curious as to, because the organizations you represent are quite significant in the field, that how much time and energy do you put into considering how the data is weaponized or how it's being used, especially by, I don't want to say, I'm looking for a word. So the situation in the Middle East right now is a good example of how you have the same issues being viewed, but then there's very polarized points of view across many discussions being had. And this is a good example of how the same information or the same data set, but the analysis of it can be used or weaponized in different scenarios. And when you add things like disinformation and, more complicated processes, what I'm wondering is, in the quest to get this openness, are you trying to put in the safeguards in place in the architecture, or is it the same thing with technology where, we can move fast and break things, and then 10 years down the line, we look back and say, we should have thought of that. And that's what I'm curious of. Your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Kadian, do you want to take a first crack at that?
Sure, yeah, I'm sure you have a lot to say too. I 100% agree. So I think that when you're dealing with conflict data, it has life or death consequences, right? It's not, you can't move fast and break things because people's lives are on the line. There's political decisions that are on the line that come from it. And so at ACLED, we take it very seriously in terms of being able to have a look into who is downloading our data, making it accessible and open to humanitarian organizations, civil society, to be able to access it and use it for their research, but also being able to look at who our user base is, look at who's downloading the data very often, who is one of our frequent downloaders from our API, engaging with them. And usually this is engagement in a very positive sense, of how can we help you use this data more fruitfully. But it also can allow us to look into who these malicious actors might be, or people who are misrepresenting the data. We've definitely run into cases where people are using the data in very public ways to say that it's saying, this thing that we don't even collect information on, and so we're able to then trace back and say, hey, this is our terms of use. This is how we expect people to engage with our data in order to first and foremost, I think, stick with our do no harm policy when it comes to something like conflict data. But Liv has many, many more thoughts on this.
Well, I won't take up too much more time, but just to echo what Kadian was saying, I think we, to answer your question directly of how much do we spend time thinking about this? We spend so much time thinking about this. We put a lot of thought into the design of our access model that Kadian was describing for this exact reason. It's about sustainability for us, but more importantly and principally, it's about a level of oversight and ensuring responsible use of data. I think I know that that's a part of the agenda for what Craft wants to talk more about in building this ecosystem. And so for us, I think that's the principal reason to have some level of control over who's accessing the data, is because open data is great, but like you said, not if it's breaking things and creating more problems and harm. And so we do take it extremely seriously. And thanks for the question. Appreciate it. I think that's a good note to end on. I'd like to give each of the panelists a chance to sum up one thought that you'd like everyone to take away with them to lunch. Extra points if it's in the form of a tagline or a hashtag. Jose, I'll start with you because you're grimacing the most.
Well, actually, it's to the question that he just asked. I think openness is a double-edged sword, and you guys see it on a day-to-day basis. On the one hand, I think it's crucial because it opens up people, the public, being able to scrutinize how data sets are being collected. And it comes back to openness. If you're open about your methodology, it makes it easy to come together and sort of, okay, we understand how you collect the data and all the caveats, and therefore we know the imperfections. And at least there's something about it, right? That's already a start. And then there's the idea of the weaponization and how it can be used to distort a picture. Or even just to say like, oh, this data set is rubbish. For whatever reason it may be, because it's politicized or because its funders are a set of group of member states organizations that might not have anything to do about the organization's bias, but it can be used as a sort of excuse to invalidate these type of data sources. I would emphasize openness. I have a conversation with Corrado all the time about the need to open more and more the analytical products that we produce. They should be considered a public good, even though obviously there's all sorts of restrictions and limitations about opening. But the more open they are, one, it's accessible, more people of the public have access to it, and it generates ideas, and it generates all sorts of innovations that can come from it. And obviously, HDX is the example. They are basically a platform that puts together all these different data providers in a way that is standardized, in a way that there's a verification process. So just by going to HDX platform, for example, they are open. You can just download the data openly, right? You don't have to do anything. This provides a degree of transparency, but also of trust, simply because they have standards. And so I would put the emphasis on openness and standardization of these things, yeah.
I'll try to fit that into a tweet, yes. Seth, let's go to you. Final words.
I won't keep you from lunch. I think just analytical accountability is what I like to emphasize, that I think we've for a long time gotten away with no oversight, and with AI and all these other buzzwords and funding flowing into the sector, I think it's only going to be worse unless we start setting in parameters to evaluate the quality, the openness, and the usefulness of analysis in the humanitarian space.
Thanks, Seth. And Kadian, the final word.
I will take a point that Seth has brought up about this brave new world in which we all come to an agreement on what these concepts mean and how best to measure them. I think it's something as a growing field of data in conflict and peace. It's something we haven't really sat down to have hard conversations about yet. Like a lot of other fields have already had these conversations, and because they are able to come to a consensus on how best to define and measure these things, they're able then to make progress on the actual outcomes of it. And I think we should think about how this, sort of constant debate about these concepts are holding us back, perhaps, from being able to make actual strides in the peace sort of mission.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for your attention for the last hour, and to the organizers. And I think we'll leave it there. Go enjoy lunch. Thank you.